I am Scott Andrews. I'm the Director of Global Evidence and Outcomes at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. My fun fact, I am the proud owner of the most prolific collection of bad haircuts that you could ever imagine having, one individual. My mother has a notorious slideshow of haircuts from the 80s, the bowl haircut, the rat tail, the mullet, the permed curly mullet, the permed curly mullet with frosty tips. And I only wanted to share that as my fun fact because I've never been more encouraged about today's youth to see the mullet come back into good standing, so long live the mullet. That's certainly my most important disclosure. That is my other disclosure there. As Tracy mentioned earlier, I have the distinction of sharing sort of the boots on the ground view of how industry has tackled some of the issues that we've mentioned this morning around measuring what matters in contemporary clinical trials. And I thought no better place to start than just depicting the voice of the patient just front and center in everything that we do. And I think we all share that as one of the founding principles. And I've surrounded that with some of the mechanisms and tools and approaches that we use to capture and mobilize the voice of the patient to really inform how we measure different endpoints in our trial. I'm only going to select two case examples to share with you today around seizure endpoint assessments as well as the LGS-associated non-seizure disorder assessments. So let's start with the first challenge here, the seizure endpoint assessment. I think Dr. Wuerl and Dr. Dlugos really paved the way for me here. And the question that we're asking ourselves is how can we optimize the measurement of dropped seizures in trials for LGS? They've already done a masterful job of describing why it is a challenge for us, but I'll just recap here. We know that dropped seizures have some challenges around identification, definition across different trials. There's certainly inconsistencies around the type of impact that a patient position might have. So a patient might not fall if they're lying down or if they're in a wheelchair, for example. There's different impacts around body involvement. So you might see different consequences for a patient that has a seizure that's whole body versus just head or other isolated portions. And this inconsistency is certainly an important concern. An inconsistency can certainly lead to variability, and we all know that variability produces noise, and certainly noise can make it difficult to detect a treatment benefit in a clinical trial. So that's one of the front and center issues that we tackled when we were designing our LGS trial. Our ideal outcome was certainly something, an endpoint that retains some of the clinical relevance that we know that's important for these patients, as well as made it easily recognizable and reliable when responding across trials or across sites in a multinational trial. Moving right along. So with those issues around drop seizures, let me just place this in context by briefly introducing the Skyway study in LGS. So this is our multi-center, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial in LGS conducted by Takeda. Just briefly, patients enter into a screening and baseline period. Then they're randomized either to soticlestat 300 milligrams or placebo. There's a titration period followed by a maintenance period. And then a patient either tapers or has the opportunity to enroll into our open label extension. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I did want to throw up here just the vast array of different endpoints that we're collecting. So this represents what we think really matters to these patients when we're thinking about designing the clinical trial. And again, I want to highlight the two that we're going to talk about today. First, as Dr. Dlugos just mentioned, our primary endpoint is that major motor drop seizure, and I'll talk a little bit of why we define that. And then finally, I want to finish with our attempt to measure this important concept around non-seizure symptoms. So again, this is just recap. We just heard this from Dr. Dlugos. I just want to walk through again, how do we go from drop seizures to major motor drop seizures? Top, just highlighting, again, historically, we're asking participants to define and classify seizures that led to a drop or to a potential drop. So how do we move to something that we think has potentially better performance characteristics? And so here's where we wanted to apply those principles of patient-focused drug development. We wanted to work with our clinicians. We wanted to work with groups like the Epilepsy Study Consortium. We wanted to define refinements to this traditional endpoint definition that we've seen across trials. And then, of course, we want to get this in front of our caregivers, our patient advocates, to the foundations, just to make sure there's understandability, that there's acceptability with these new definitions. So what we arrived at was, again, what was described in this red box. It is these classifications from the ILA-AE seizure categories, and then we specified the particular body type involvement. And Dr. Dlugos already mentioned that we're mostly focusing on trunk and lower extremities, excluding things like isolated head drops and other things involving only the face or the arms. So again, the result is an entirely new definition, the major motor drop seizures. But I think the process that we use really highlights that we can still define something that has new operational characteristics, hopefully a little bit more accuracy, reducing variability, in the end still retains that element that we think really represents what's truly meaningful and important to the patients. So let me move now to the second issue that I want to tackle. And again, this has been a frequent topic, and I know it's going to be a topic of deep discussion later in the afternoon. And that's the question here is, how do we optimize the measure of non-seizure symptoms in current clinical trials for LGS? Again, a lot of the challenger obstacles have already been noted, but I'll just recap them here. Certainly, there's issues with the disease presentation. So, of course, there is symptom heterogeneity. There is a spectrum of intellectual disability that we see. There's also a general lack of self-report for these patients. I think adding to that fact is that existing epilepsy clinical outcome assessments oftentimes are not suitable for LGS because they lack optimal content validity. So maybe they're capturing things that aren't really resonating with the day-to-day lived-in experience for our patients with LGS, or certainly weren't designed to be sensitive to change for these patients. So here, the ideal solution that we're looking for a clinical outcome assessment for non-seizure symptoms would be sensitive to change in a population with that heterogeneous disease presentation. It would be, again, intuitive to use, and then flexible across a spectrum of disability. So how do you do that, right? If I can summarize that, I think we could call it a day, but that's certainly not going to happen. I would certainly recommend you either have Dr. Campbell on speed dial, or you can turn to the updated patient-focused drug development guidance. And I just want to depict that here. We're not going to have time to go into great detail. But what I love about this, and I think everybody's come to really appreciate, is it certainly encourages the capture of patient experience data, that voice of the patient, and to deeply embed that across the entire continuum of development for these clinical outcome assessments. So I'm just going to use this as a roadmap just to walk through. This is how we approached it. It's certainly not the only way, but we wanted to use this type of framework to think through how we're going to develop a new measure. So the rest of the slides are going to contain essentially the same template. You're going to see essentially a summary of the steps that are represented in patient-focused drug development. If I'm starting from square one, how do I develop this new measure? And then you're going to see in the call-out boxes on the right a summary of what we stepped through and what we learned. So the first step, you're thinking about these two first steps recognized in patient-focused drug development. How do we understand the disease or condition? How do we start understanding the relevant concepts around benefit and risk? You could certainly, of course, you don't have to develop a conceptual disease model. We thought that would be very instructive to have this mapping of the different relevant items, features, impacts, just to understand that important interplay for patients with LGS. To do that, looking at the methodology, we started with a literature search. We certainly conducted this in coordination with experts and with the foundation. We then drafted a conceptual model. So what are these aspects of the disease and how do they interplay? And then finally, we used that conversation with experts and our patient advocates in the foundation to refine that disease conceptual model. So here, I just want to summarize what that final output looks like. This is the conceptual model for LGS. For the sake of time, we won't be able to go into all detail, but what I want to maybe share is that this really is intended to represent that lived experience for patients and caregivers. In summary, we had 5 key features and 4 key impacts that you can see here. And how we use this is this essentially serves now as a framework to say, here are the most relevant and important concepts and items that we want to start thinking about when we're going to develop a new measure for non-seizure symptoms. So the next step is we have this conceptual model. We're starting this framework. We have the right sort of substrate. How do we then develop that measure? How do we develop a disease order-specific measure for non-seizure symptoms? So here again, we started with a review of existing clinical outcome assessment measures. And once again, we wanted to immediately turn to the community of expert clinicians and working with the foundation directly to understand the measures that are out there. How well do they map to the concepts that are important to these stakeholders? And are they suitable? We then conducted item-level analyses of many of the measures that were already described in some of these other overviews from our phase 2 trial, the Electra study that was conducted with Ovid Therapeutics. We then also had the benefit of direct patient input or caregiver input from phase 2 exit interviews. So participants of our study, we were able to ask them about their overall experience in the trial, but also the other relevant signs, symptoms, impacts that they face and what sort of observations they noted during the trial period. And then finally, we used a Delphi panel. So we used this systematic process of how do we gain consensus to start with many items to final items. So here, I'll just briefly depict what that process looks like that I just mentioned. So at the top of this slide, you're seeing all of the robust inputs we had. Again, the literature review inputs. We had the expert interviews, we had the item level analysis, we had all the exit interviews from our phase 2 study. That helped us generate a starting list of 13 items. And we took those 13 items that represent potential candidates for non-seizure symptoms and introduced them into this Delphi panel. The lower portion of the slide that you're looking at is a depiction of that Delphi panel process. So again, this is an expert group that sit together, they debate, they assess each item against an a priori criteria to advance that item if it has the appropriate properties. So each level represents a different round, and you're going to see as you look at these 3 different successive rounds with the purple box, you're going to see that some items fall out. So they certainly could fall out if they lack optimal relevance, if they have overlap with other items, or certainly if there's issues with clarity during that discussion. And you can see in the bottom right, the output of this process was we arrived at 3 final items that we wanted to include in our final measure, and that's the items of communication, alertness, and disruptive behaviors. So finally, having these items, we wanted to support and further validate this measure. This was a clinical global impression, and as Dr. Worrell sort of described what that looks like, that's asking the participants or the respondents that, based on changes you observe from baseline, what have you noted about the patient's status on these 3 items? And you have that 7-level Likert response options from very much improved all the way down to very much worsened. To support the validation, we wanted to now do some additional cognitive interviewing. So work again with caregivers that would be helping input into this, into the responses during a clinical trial, to do some debriefing, as well as to do some confirmatory concept elicitation. So when we ask them about what's the most relevant thing about their patient, are they proactively mentioning some of these items that we already selected? So here is just a brief qualitative summary of a lot of the feedback that we got. And again, we're asking about 3 things in particular. We wanted to get an understanding of their ability to understand. So can they describe their patient in terms of the 3 items in our measure? We then ask about relevance. So were these things that were resonating with their day-to-day lived experience? And then finally, importantly, we ask about importance. How important and impactful are these 3 items to you and to your loved one? And maybe easier to walk through is just a quantitative summary of that process. So this top table, you're again looking at a summary of their ability to endorse the understanding and relevance. So across these 3 items, I've boxed the LGS respondents. And you see almost universally 100% of the respondents were able to understand the instructions, describe their patient, and note that it was highly relevant for their patient or loved one. When you think about the importance scoring, we asked them to rate from a scale of 0 to 10. And here I've reported the percentage that indicated that it was at least a 7 out of 10 or higher. And we see for the communication item, 100% of the respondents said that this was important, 7 or 10 or higher. I believe it is 83% for alertness and 80% for disruptive behaviors. And then finally, the last item that I'll share is just what level of change is considered clinically important on this measure. And I think universally, again, it was minimal change. And I think what stood out that to me when I saw that is that certainly minor changes are profoundly important. I think that resonates so well with the Instone project, for example, that we'll hear about later today that Gabi's champion and Dr. Berg and Dr. Downs will talk about. Even a minor change, hugely important to these patients. And I'll leave it here for the summary conclusions. I'm at my time. Thank you so much.